And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, March 30th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're grounding the week in how government power, capacity, and oversight are shaping the federal landscape right now. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, billions are flowing into munitions production, but there are limits as to how quickly the U.S. can replenish its stockpiles. Plus, both the U.S. and the EU are quietly narrowing chances for the public to weigh in on new rules, and one expert says it's time to pay attention. Those stories and much more ahead on this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. As the conflict in the Middle East escalates following the U.S. and Israel's launch of a major combat operation against Iran, Defense Department employees say the demands of a new war are adding strain to an already stretched workforce. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me with more details. Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Hi, Terry.
You got this kind of insight through a poll that you conducted. Tell us about it. What kinds of questions? Who answered?
As you mentioned, of course, the Defense Department has been undergoing major changes since the beginning of the second Trump administration, including organizational restructuring, reduction in its civilian workforce. So it has faced multiple challenges since then, a major one being workforce shortages. But these changes have also impacted morale and trust in leadership. So given all these various challenges and constraints, we wanted to conduct this kind of very quick pulse check to get a better understanding of what the workforce is going through, and how what the administration calls military operations in Iran are impacting day to day for DoD employees. So we asked questions like, how would you rate your organization's ability to accomplish its mission right now? How would you rate your staffing levels to meet current mission demands? How often maybe you've been performing duties outside of your primary role due to workforce shortages? We also asked about operational tempo, whether it's increased or it stayed the same. And we also asked questions about confidence in their leadership, about challenges that have emerged over the past month and how the operations are impacting the day-to-day. We had about 150 people take the pulse poll. It's a small sample size, but I think it's a good glimpse into what the workforce is currently dealing with.
As you looked at the responses, what are your big takeaways?
It's definitely that the Defense Department's workforce was already under strain, and this new conflict is making it much worse. Organizations are already understaffed, but operational tempo rises pretty quickly. So one DoD said, and I quote, with the convergence of organizational changes, staff reductions, and a war in a resource-constrained environment, it feels almost impossible to sustain the mission. I also had another employee who said that they used to have 4 times the number of people. The workload keeps increasing with the calls for increased production that we've been talking about and the current war. Another employee that I wanted to highlight at the Defense Contract Management Agency, and that agency makes sure that weapons that are delivered to warfighters meet all the performance requirements. That person said that budget cuts and workforce reductions are undermining the organization's missions, and also they said that it's only getting worse. So we had more than 50% of respondents say that they've been performing duties outside of their primary role due to those workforce shortages. And we also had more than 50% of respondents say that they have insufficient staffing levels to support the mission of their organization.
Anastasia, those would have probably been true even without the increased op tempo from the operations in Iran. So how does the ongoing operation affect the op tempo for the civilian part of DoD?
We had about 40% of respondents say that the operational tempo is a lot higher than it was a month ago. About 28% of respondents said that it's slightly higher than it was a month ago. And going back to that DCMA employee who said, and I quote, "We're asked to do more, but we cannot, and something will eventually fail and fail badly."
Wow, that can cause you to take a deep breath when you hear responses like that. Across all of the responses, then what inferences do you draw about morale inside the Pentagon right now?
We conducted a survey post the shutdown last year, and federal workers said that morale and trust in leadership was at an all-time low when we conducted that survey, and that was in 2025. Now, in the past month, DoD employees said that the conditions have kind of only worsened, with most respondents reporting further decline in morale. We had about 57% of people saying that morale is much lower than it was last month. One employee said that leadership has not shown leadership, and I quote, "The lack of morale will bite them. If and when we need to go to a wartime pace, the workforce will not elevate the level of effort." Another employee said that so far they've only seen morale being affected, but if the war drags on, then it would most likely increase the operational tempo and the workload. Plus, for many DoD employees, the immediate impact of current operations being reflected in longer hours, they're covering someone else's responsibilities, they're being pulled away from their duties to cover for someone else. So all of that is just snowballing.
Would you say that the responses you got indicate that this emotion or this take on morale and mission is widely distributed across the Pentagon, or really only in certain areas?
Yeah, again, it's a small sample size, but when I asked how it's impacting the day-to-day, a number of respondents did say that they're not experiencing any significant disruptions. Their day-to-day hasn't changed, or at least for now. Someone said, we are not experiencing any impact right now until battle damage need repair. Someone also said that there is kind of no direct mention of the war, and it's kind of being ignored, but it's hard to go on knowing what's happening. But many respondents did highlight all of the challenges that we've been talking about, which is high operational tempo, prioritizing other requirements to meet emerging needs, more work for less people, and redirecting of funding from their daily operations to support the military operations in Iran.
Definitely something we need to keep our eye on then as the operation continues.
Absolutely.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, both the U.S. and the EU are quietly narrowing opportunities for the public to weigh in on new regulations. And one expert said that shift deserves closer scrutiny. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. New research argues that opportunities for public comment are shrinking on both sides of the Atlantic as governments move faster and give people less time to respond. Those shortcuts may seem efficient, but they come with real risks for transparency and the quality of policymaking. Stephen Bala, co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at George Washington University, is here to explain the pros and cons. Professor Bala, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Your recent research argues that both the U.S. and the EU are cutting back on opportunities for public comment in the regulatory space. So for those of us who are kind of federal regulatory nerds, why is that important?
Well, public commenting is one of the key principles of good governance and regulatory policymaking, along with regulatory impact analysis, benefit cost analysis. So analyzing the benefits and costs of regulations, and then also asking the public what it thinks. And so given that public commenting is one of the key core principles of regulatory policymaking, any efforts to erode its prevalence in the process is something to take note of.
Let's take the EU first and kind of dive into what's happening there. They've got new expedited procedures as one example. How is that working?
Well, it's really interesting in that public commenting is a much more recent phenomenon in the EU than here in the United States, where we've been doing it for close to a century. And so I find it particularly noteworthy that just 10 years after rolling out new public comment requirements for policymaking, The European Commission is now in the process, apparently, of dialing some of those back. And what's interesting is over the past 10 years, they've developed a public comment regime that we might think is even more robust than in the United States, in that over the course of a policymaking process, stakeholders may have as many as 4 opportunities to offer feedback to what's happening. But those are now being rolled back in the interest of expediting policymaking, dealing with crises, those sorts of imperatives that governments around the world are facing today.
Are the European citizens rising up and complaining about a loss of opportunity?
If I had to guess, I would argue, and this would be true on both sides of the Atlantic, that most citizens have no idea this is happening. And I think this is one reason why a conversation like this is important.
Well, let's talk about what's happening on the U.S. side then. The Trump administration is using the Administrative Procedures Act good cause exception to get after some of those same goals: efficiency, speed, timeliness. How's that going?
Yeah, it's really interesting in that the governments on both sides of the Atlantic are quite different in their policy objectives. But nevertheless, both sets of governments are really interested in economic performance, affordability, all of these bread and butter issues. And so they find these procedures, these good governance principles, to be in the way of quick achievement of those aims. And so in the U.S. context, the Trump administration has a deregulatory agenda. It's made no secret about that. That's one of its main objectives. And it sees these procedures as getting in the way. And so as a result is interested in using this legal maneuver, the good cause exception in the Administrative Procedure Act, to avoid public comment when it's rescinding existing regulations.
How do you balance the tension between deliberation and inclusion with speed? Our system is designed to be slow on purpose.
You've hit the tension. You hit the nail on the head with that tension, and that's the core issue, I think, at play here, which is, on the one hand, in a democracy, we want the people's voices to be heard. We want stakeholders to have an opportunity to provide information to policymakers. On the other hand, economic competitiveness, speed in policymaking, especially in times that are changing and uncertain, is really important. So I don't want to suggest that dialing back public commenting processes are necessarily problematic. It's just that we'd like to think carefully about why we're doing it. Be aware of that tension that you've raised. And what I'm afraid of on both sides of the Atlantic is that policymakers are in a rush to change without really conceiving of what some of the unintended consequences of these changes might be. And we could talk about some of those unintended consequences.
We'll do that in just a minute. I'm speaking with Stephen Bala. He's co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at GW. Now let's come back to some of those policy choices. How are they playing out?
Well, for sure, they're allowing both the Trump administration here in the U.S. and the European Commission to make policy changes at a quite rapid rate, at a much more rapid rate than we're used to seeing in advanced industrialized democracies, right? You talked earlier about the fact that the policymaking process is designed to be deliberate, some might say slow, but we're seeing quite rapid change in a lot of these areas. And so removing these public comment processes has real implications for the speed of policy change and then, by extension, the actual substance of policy that's emerging from governments on both sides of the Atlantic.
What role is technology playing in speeding up this process?
Well, what's interesting is that we thought that technology was going to really bog down the public comment process, in that it would be really easy for advocacy groups to send in large numbers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of comments to government agencies, and that would slow down the process. Or that technology might make it easier for bad actors to use bots and other elements to spam the comment process. We haven't seen, other than a few notable examples, we haven't seen that yet on a large scale. And so what's interesting in that is that the technological developments of recent years haven't fundamentally changed the dynamics of the public comment process.
You mentioned, and I have to agree with you, I think we have to be honest, that there's really only a tiny sliver of the population that plays this game anyway. is there an argument that says actually speed is better because it limits the number of people that can be involved? Only those who are passionately interested in the topic at hand are going to respond. It's better if we keep that quick and short.
There's an argument to be made there. I'll push back a little bit in that I think part of the public comment process is for the so-called insiders, right? The Beltway bandits, if you will, to use a pejorative term. Part of it is for the stakeholders. Maybe that's a nicer way to say it, for the stakeholders to bring new information into the process that agencies might not be aware of or might not be aware of how important it is to stakeholders. But we have to think that the policymaking process is not just a legal administrative process. It's also occurring inside a democratic political system. And so I think it's a legitimate goal of the public comment process for it to reach out to a broader public. So for mass membership groups to encourage their members to send large numbers of comments to agencies, which does happen on occasion. And so the public comment process is an interesting hybrid, I think, of both technical, legal, economic information on the one hand that's held by a small number of specialists and insiders. But on the other hand, it's part of democratic policymaking, and all players are welcome in that sense.
Let's go back to the EU for a minute, because you mentioned up front that there have been as many as 4 opportunities for folks to participate and comment on particular regulations. Is that process holding up? Are they getting the kind of participation that they want, or how are they changing that?
So I think some of the early returns on the EU's innovations in public commenting are pretty positive. And that's why it's surprising that there's such a quick move to scale those back or walk away from some of them. I do think there's been some really good reviews, good analysis that suggests new information is being brought. And this is important in the EU context because the European Commission naturally suffers from a democracy deficit, if you will, because it's a supranatural policymaking entity, very different from what we're talking about here in the United States.
Well, then coming back to the United States, thinking about our system and the arguments this administration has made for moving faster, are there some reforms that you would want to see put on the table that could make it more responsive, be open to the public, and still kind of address the need for the regulatory process to move as fast as the situation might require?
One of the reforms I'm interested in, and it's been around Capitol Hill for years now, is to have public commenting at an earlier stage of regulatory policymaking. One of the issues with commenting as it's currently constituted is that it occurs at a relatively late stage of the process. Agencies have already spent maybe years developing their proposal. Positions have hardened. And that leads to a lot of legal tussling over agency rules. I personally would like to see much earlier public engagement at a point where agencies are still scoping out initial ideas. They might be more receptive to public input. And even this might sound counterintuitive. I think earlier participation could have the effect of, in the overall scheme of things, expediting the development of policy because we don't have these later in the process delays that might be associated with knockdown, drag 'em out fights in later public commenting as it's now constituted.
Are you sensing any movement in that direction?
Well, unfortunately, in today's environment on Capitol Hill, everything gets sucked into a polarization vortex. And so if one party emerges as the champion of a particular reform, and in the case of earlier public commenting, it tends to be Republicans who are in favor of that, that then has the boomerang effect of many Democrats see it as an inherently anti-regulatory reform, which I don't necessarily share that sense of how it would operate in practice. I think it's a procedurally neutral reform that both the left and the right could use to their benefit when they hold the levers of government in their hands.
It sounds like we need some participative governance on that topic.
Absolutely.
I've been speaking with Stephen Bala. He's co-director of the Regulatory Studies Center at the George Washington University. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, they're on recess, but DHS funding, voting rules, and overseas troop support are all waiting when Congress comes back. But first, as policymakers push to rebuild U.S. munitions stockpiles, a flood of funding is running up against hard limits on industrial capacity. We'll take a closer look at what it really takes to scale production and why it's not as simple as just writing a check. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Ongoing U.S. operations tied to Iran are driving a rapid drawdown of munitions, putting new pressure on the defense industrial base. While billions have already been invested to expand production, questions remain about how resilient that system really is under stress. To explore what matters most right now, I'm joined by the director of the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS, Jerry McGinn. Jerry, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to be with you, Terry.
We got a very timely topic. You focus on the industrial base, and you have a new piece out looking specifically at the munitions industrial base. And certainly with current operations, that's been in the news a lot. That space got billions of dollars from last year's One Big Beautiful Bill Act. There's talk about a $200 billion supplemental. What really is the state of the munitions industrial base right now?
Yeah, well, thanks, Terry. Great question. We have put a fair amount of money into the munitions industrial base. The One Big Beautiful Bill had $25 billion focusing on munitions. But the challenge is presidents of both parties keep using them. So we've used them in the Midnight Hammer last summer with the first attack on Iran. Used them for other operations for Maduro around Christmas last year. So we've been using them and expanding them, and they're very costly to build and take some time. So we have to build both the depth and what I call the breadth of the industrial base of munitions.
Not only our own use, but we've been providing them to allies, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we've provided at least Patriots and 155 munitions in Ukraine, and some of our allies have provided those too. And we're doing co-production of Patriots in Poland, for instance.
So the early estimates from the current operation in Iran were $1 billion a day in predominantly munitions costs, and that's a pace that most people didn't anticipate. Based on what you're seeing, what is our real capacity to rebuild that? How long does it take? What are the glitches in the supply chain?
Yeah, I think we did use a lot in the beginning, and I think we used the real standoff weapons. We know like Tomahawk and theater air missile defense and Patriot. Those are really expensive munitions, and so we used those beginning. But now that they've established air dominance, they're using less expensive kind of munitions like laser guided bombs, for instance. So I think the rate of expenditure will be in terms of costs not as great, but we do have this chronic challenge of how do we rebuild and replenish our stockpiles, and so I think that's what was, as you mentioned, the supplemental request by the administration, getting more of these munitions kind of built, and I think there are some chronic challenges to address, but some of it just is money, but also what types of munitions we buy.
Let's start with the money first. We throw $25 billion at it, maybe more. Where does that money go? What's most important to spend it on?
Yeah, I think if you looked at that $25 billion, it went to things like Patriot, Tomahawk, the JASSM missile, and the challenge is those are the numbers add up pretty quick, and so $25 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it didn't buy that much in those exquisite munitions.
When we think about buying the munitions, though, sometimes we think that money is buying the missile in the box. Talk to me about the complexity of the supply chain to put a missile together.
Yeah, no, I think one of the challenges is, these incredibly capable munitions. But, they were developed over many years, and they're very exquisite in terms of the materials involved. And essentially, a lot of them are handmade, So scaling production, you can't just stamp them out like one every other day. It takes, up to a month to build some of these munitions. And then they do have some long lead items or challenges like solid rocket motors and so on. And that's been a lot of the focus recently, is like, how do we get rid of these and address these supply chain bottlenecks? And you see there was a number of large deals that were signed between the Department of the War, Department of Defense, and companies. And that was around both the munitions themselves, but also some of those subcomponents.
So there's specialty materials, unique metals. What What about the workforce? Do we have the workforce to actually scale up production in this capacity?
I think companies respond to incentives, right? And so if the government lays out multi-year contracts that they're clearly going to buy this amount of munitions or this amount of this weapon system, companies can respond to that and they'll adjust their workforce. So I think the workforce for these items, I think is just going to respond to the demand signal from contracts.
I'm speaking with Jerry McGinn. He's the director for the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS. Jerry, one of the ideas that's gaining some traction is having the government take an equity stake in key defense contractors to stabilize capacity. What's your thought on that? Is that a way to help address some of these capacity shortfalls that we're talking about?
Well, one of the things the government is doing is they are making longer-term commitments. They are doing things such as when they invested in rare earths last year with MP Materials, which is the largest producer of rare earths in the United States, they did a 10-year agreement, an offtake agreement, with a guaranteed price floor. So that gave stability for the MP Materials to know they're going to have that much demand. They also included a government-backed loan, $150 million through the Office of Strategic Capital, and then a private sector loan of up to $1 billion. And so those components were significant in helping stabilize demand. The additional thing they added was this government equity stake you're talking about. This is not something that the U.S. government has done. I mean, there have been one or two cases in the past 100 years. It's not a traditional practice. So it's not clear how that's going to work out in time, but that is what the government is trying to do is create some stability in demand and really kind of make the environment ripe for investment in this area.
Jerry, we've talked predominantly about the really expensive, exquisite, precision-guided munitions, but you make the case that there are a lot of other things we need to add to our portfolio of munitions that could help us be more successful at lower cost. Walk us through what the other pieces should be.
Yeah, the way I talk about it is sort of that we need breadth. In some ways, I'm not sure we're ever going to have enough depth because we use these munitions. So we need cheaper, less expensive alternatives that can cover a range of missions. They're not going to do the same things as some of these exquisite missiles, but they can get us like 85% there. And that is things such as short-range, attritable, low-cost drones, such as there was one, an Iranian drone called the Shahed, which we actually reverse engineered and deployed in Epic Fury. It's called Lucas, low-cost munitions. I forget what that exactly stands for. But they deployed those. And they're also doing this drone dominance program in the Department of Defense, which is a lot of startups are engaged. But the other area, which I think is really, really important, is they're developing what's called the Family of Affordable Mass Munitions, or FAM. And so the whole idea there is that, as we talked about, the real exquisite munitions that we build today are really, essentially handmade, and you can't really scale. You can scale production to a degree, but you can't just really crank out missiles. So the whole idea of this family of affordable mass munitions is like building missiles that are good enough, that have about 85% of the capabilities, but you can build them much faster, have more producible, have more common parts so you don't have supply chain issues, and then you can sort of build the prints, where you can have contract manufacturing almost to them. So that's a big focus, and I think a really, really smart investment that is coming from principally the Air Force has been leading that effort.
Certainly, Secretary Hegseth's arsenal of freedom implies that they want to do this in a broad way.
Yep.
Are you seeing any impact from those early movements?
Yeah, no, I think this reflects some of that. The focus on the big deals, of really kind of doing investments, I think is one. These low-cost drones as well as low-cost missiles, that emphasis. And interestingly, another focus that doesn't receive as much attention is there is actually a focus on co-production. That is kind of working with our allies and partners. Like I mentioned, in Poland, they're building Patriots. They also build Patriots and Standard missiles in Japan. And so there are efforts to, you essentially can increase production by, with a little help from your friends.
Let's back out a little bit again and then kind of look at the overall lessons we're learning right now from current operations. When you think about it and you study the defense industrial base broadly, are there places where you see the industrial base as being especially fragile and places maybe where it's proved to be more robust than you expected?
Yeah, I think the industrial base is all about responding to incentives. So I think the government sets the market and they regulate the market. And so they have tremendous power to really send market signals that the companies will respond to. And I think that's what I think is a really strong focus of, Secretary Hegseth's Arsenal of Freedom approach. It lays out kind of those areas. And I think you're seeing companies respond. I mean, I think there are going to be ups and downs along the way. Like one of the things that the department has been focusing on, these other transactions authorities. How do we prototype systems? And that's great. But the problem is, what does that lead to? Does it lead to just prototypes, or what do you produce, right? So that's where you've got to kind of go from experimentation and prototyping and demonstrations to production, and that's tougher than saying it. And so I think that's an area where we'll see how the industrial base responds and how government can incentivize them.
Well, this administration certainly has put a focus on the industrial base, perhaps more than we've seen in quite a while, and money toward it. If policymakers really want to know whether these investments are working, what indicators should they be watching? Not just production numbers, but competitiveness, capacity. How would you measure it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there are several ways. One of the ways is, again, setting up measures because, as I mentioned, like there have been a big emphasis on experimentation and prototyping, but we don't really know how many of these prototyping efforts translate to production. So understanding that better helps us understand how much innovation is working. And I think we do have to measure production rates. We have to look at levels of competition. And I think the government, to be fair, is doing very strong here. Is they're really focused on not just developing systems that we produce for 50 years by one vendor, but how do we have multiple vendors providing the same or similar products. So that way you've got a more robust, diverse industrial base. And you're seeing that on the prototyping stage now, and now I want to get there on the program stage.
So a year from now, what will you be watching for to see if these investments have paid off?
I'll be watching things like the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft. So they have 3 companies producing prototypes. A traditional company, Boeing, a company that's long been in the UAV space, General Atomics, and a newer company, Enduro, right? And so I'll be interested to see how those develop, how many do they build from each of those companies, who's more successful, who struggles, and then what do they do with the next phase of that? So how they kind of incentivize and then, and how companies respond is what I'll be watching.
I've been speaking with Jerry McGinn, Director for the Center for the Industrial Base at CSIS. Jerry, thanks so much for joining me.
Really great to be with you again, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, they're on recess, but DHS funding, voting rules, and overseas troop support are all waiting when Congress comes back. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Congress is heading into the Easter recess with DHS still unfunded and no clear path to a deal. The president's move to ensure TSA agents continue getting paid may buy time, but it doesn't resolve the broader standoff or the demands piling up behind it. Lauren Duggan of Bloomberg Government joins me with the latest read on where things stand and what's likely to move or harden during the break. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Last week ended with some fireworks on Capitol Hill that kind of continued into the weekend. So walk us through what happened and where we are today regarding funding for the Department of Homeland Security.
So DHS remains in its partial shutdown, and there was this burst of activity on Friday. Very early in the morning Friday, the Senate passed a bill that would have funded everything except ICE and parts of CBP, which were 2 of the key components in immigration enforcement. That arrived in the House, which over the course of the day, Republicans there rejected that approach and instead sent back a 60-day full funding CR for the entire department. But that now awaits in the Senate, which is already left for recess. And then the House followed them out the door late Friday night. So what we have is a standoff. We're still, have an unfunded department, except for where there's money from other sources like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed last year, but no resolution really in sight with the 2 chambers, at least for now, scheduled to be out for a 2-week recess.
The president did sign an executive order last Thursday directing the Department of Homeland Security to pay members of the Transportation Security Agency. So their paychecks should start rolling out this week. But that doesn't solve the bigger problem across the department.
It doesn't. And, it was a memo that came, I think, as you said, to the Department of Homeland Security, and they're going to find funding that's related to TSA and use that to pay the TSA workers. So they'll have paychecks, and ICE and CBP have largely had paychecks as well because of the money that's been flowing through. That means that the TSA agents who weren't being paid were side by side with ICE agents who were, when some of them were deployed to airports last week. So that will be the case for now. It might take a little bit of the pressure off, but those long lines, we still saw some of those over the weekend at some airports, and I think the pressure will still be there to do something about this.
The language that both chambers were using as they left on Friday was no compromise. How do they get this to closure even when they get back?
It's a good question, because what the Senate passed felt like a compromise. It was passed by unanimous consent, which meant any one senator could have stopped it. There were only a few on the floor when they actually did the processing of it, but it went by UC and went forward. In the House, we saw that it was a pretty party line affair there. So they're going to have to get back to the table. This could reopen the discussion, by the way, about some of those changes to immigration enforcement policy, which the version that the Senate had passed, by leaving ICE funding out of it, there were no new conditions placed on ICE officers or others doing immigration enforcement. So we'll have to see if that comes back as a dynamic when they reopen these talks, because once you put that funding back in, that might be part of the conversation.
There's another big issue that's out there for them when they get back from recess, which of course is support and funding for ongoing combat ops. 2 weeks of recess, who knows what will happen in the operations in that time frame, and more troops are headed in that direction. So what are members saying now? What are they going to be looking at when they get back?
Well, there is still a lot of concern on Capitol Hill about what's happening. There have been briefings, and there are questions about what a $200 billion, which was the number that I guess the Pentagon was sending to the White House. We'll see what they actually sent up to Capitol Hill, but they'll be looking at that very closely to see what's in it and what that would entail. There was some concern last week among members about going away for 2 weeks and what might happen operationally. Ground troops has entered the discussion as a possibility, not necessarily the plan, but members wondered, if we're gone for 2 weeks, what might that mean with a dynamic there, with some members saying, should we be talking again about authorizing what's going on in Iran? Not that they did so before they left, as we saw, but Iran is definitely going to be hanging over all this, both monetarily and operationally, when people get back in a couple of weeks. And of course, they'll be monitoring it from home and probably hearing about it from their constituents in their states and districts.
I'm speaking with Lauren Duggan. He's Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, what impact will this recess and these two big issues, Homeland Security and combat ops, what impact will all of that have on the rest of the unfinished business that is setting on the agenda for members of Congress?
Well, certainly we're looking toward a fiscal 2027 appropriation season. We've got to get to the next series of bills before October 1st. Even if they don't finish them by then, they'll want to get to work on that. And a big monetary supplemental in the form of Iran or whatever else rides with that will be feeding into that. But there's a lot else on the agenda. They have been talking about doing a highway bill this year. They've been talking about tackling the FISA surveillance authorities that run out right when they come back from recess. And that just adds to the plate that they have to deal with in that first week they're back in April. So there's a lot still on the agenda and a lot unfinished. The Save America Act, which we've talked about before, was on the floor for a couple of weeks. Presumably will still be on the floor when they come back, and we'll have to see how they approach that.
Well, let's dig into some of those 2027 funding questions in detail, because the president has said he will send his budget up to the Hill on April 3rd. That's a couple of months later than it's supposed to be, but I think people are like, well, great, at least we'll have one to look at. And OMB Director Russ Vought is scheduled to testify shortly after the members of Congress get back from recess. What will you be watching for that? What are you expecting?
We'll be watching to see in general. There were deep cuts proposed last year, and Congress went along with some cuts, but not as deep as the administration wanted. So what will this request look like? Would it hew closer to the level of cuts that were enacted, or go deeper again? What does he do about the education department that he's talked about dismantling? Will there be a $1.5 trillion request for defense, as was suggested earlier this year as perhaps the goal for the administration. So we'll be looking to see broadly what those numbers are, and then some of the individual agencies, what they seek there, some of the things they want to prioritize this year. What do they say about Homeland Security funding? And do they make another request for a reconciliation style bill that would be outside the regular process as maybe a way to solve some of the thorny issues? And maybe the Republicans will go along with that on the Hill to try and get those things through without needing 60 votes.
Might this be an opportunity to revisit that ever popular topic of impoundments? It doesn't seem like the administration is going to be spending all of their 2026 appropriations by the time Mr. Vogt gets up there to testify.
I'm sure there will be questions about that. The so-called pocket rescissions at the end of the year that some folks were concerned about last year. Maybe we'll see if that is an issue again this year. But Vogt's testimony will be closely watched. Democrats will have a lot of questions for him, certainly, and maybe some Republicans as well.
On top of all of that, there's new energy to the conversation about a reconciliation bill for 2027. Where is that conversation headed?
I think it has some renewed energy, in part because of this Homeland Security issue, in part because the president in general is very down on the filibuster and wants Republicans in the Senate to blow that up to get his priorities through. But with some of the funding questions before them, whether it's the money for Iran or the money for DHS, particularly ICE and CBP, and maybe some of these election questions they've tried to do in the Save America Act, there's talk about moving that over as well. And then some discussion about, do we go after fraud in programs or look for improper payments, things like that. So both parties would have goals. It's going to be a very narrow path to get through, given the slim majorities, but that might be their best way to get some of these funding things resolved without needing 60 votes in the Senate.
And Lauren, the recess isn't really a time when no work is getting done. People are still on the Hill. Staffers are still working. What are you going to be tracking over the next couple of weeks to tell you maybe which way the wind is blowing when the members are back in session?
Certainly what the budget says will be big because that'll be part of the discussion. But then what is done on FISA? Are there announcements made over the next couple of weeks? Because that's as much a party management as a policy question. How does Mike Johnson craft a bill to get that through his House, given some of the procedural difficulties? So they might release something early on so people have time to digest it. Certainly in the couple of days before they come back on April 13th, we'll be looking to see what they're scheduling for the week ahead and what's kind of coming to light, because maybe there will be something agreed in principle before they come back. But as you said, people work the phones, people hop on Zoom calls. They don't stop working just because they're not in Washington.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Freedom of Information Act backlogs have been increasing across government for years, but the Trump administration's workforce cuts have deepened challenges for already strained federal FOIA offices. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday is here with more detail. Justin, thanks for joining me.
Good to be here, Terry.
FOIA is sometimes not a particularly well understood or appreciated law inside federal government. How did the staffing cuts specifically impact the work of agency FOIA offices?
Yeah, it's interesting. It had been suspected for the past year that a lot of these staffing reductions would really strain FOIA offices who were already reporting being understaffed prior to the Trump administration in many cases. But recently, the chief FOIA officer reports and the annual FOIA data reports were released by the Justice Department, and that kind of confirms what a lot of folks already knew from what they were observing in the FOIA landscape. FOIA backlogs and delays are on the rise, and a lot of blame is on kind of the deferred resignation program and other workforce reductions that cut federal FOIA staff across agencies. If you look at the Defense Department's chief FOIA officer report, their FOIA backlog at DoD rose by 42% last year. DoD's chief FOIA officer attributed the increase in backlogs to a loss of staff. In fact, they called it the primary driver of the increases, and they specifically pointed at the deferred resignation program. DoD reports that across its components, there was a 37% loss or turnover in FOIA officers. So that's particularly acute at DoD. And I read through the reports across multiple other agencies, Commerce Department, Education Department, Energy Department, and so on. it's largely the same story. Their FOIA backlogs are not quite as large as DoD's, but they saw an increase, and they are pointing to staffing cuts as one of the big reasons for that.
Justin, is it really just the FOIA offices and the loss of folks there, or are there staffing cuts that went farther than those offices that have an impact on the processing of the records requests?
Yes, yeah, it's a great point because FOIA offices obviously manage and oversee and kind of serve as a central intake for FOIA requests in a lot of cases. But a lot of different employees across government touch the FOIA process when that records request has to go out and be processed. The General Services Administration saw a 43% increase in FOIA requests last year. Most of those were received by GSA's Central Administrative Office, which lost 30% of its staff to attrition and deferred resignation and retirements. And so their FOIA backlog increased. The Merit Systems Protection Board also saw a big increase in their backlogs. And MSPB's chief FOIA officer explained that while many of the departed employees did not work directly for the FOIA office, the loss and resulting shift in responsibilities did impact FOIA processing. And so you're seeing across government that not only those those FOIA officers who are in charge of the process basically seeing attrition, you're seeing the attrition across government making it harder to process FOIA requests because there's just less people to do the job.
So it sounds like the backlog would have grown regardless with the loss of staff, but it sounds also like there was an increase in FOIA requests. So an increase in demand and a decrease in staff together really aggravated the problem.
That's right. And for several years, FOIA offices have been chasing their tails because you've seen this increase in FOIA requests year over year. Artificial intelligence is making it easier for people to make FOIA requests. You also are seeing some agencies point to a rise of serial FOIA requesters who pepper agencies with FOIA requests. So you're seeing that increase in demand at the same time that you're seeing, at least before last year, kind of a flat of staffing levels at FOIA offices. And then last year, the FOIA staff reductions just kind of collided with those increasing requests, and backlogs are again through the roof. I should know we don't have the annual FOIA reports for some pretty important agencies: the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Veterans Affairs. Those three account for the vast majority of FOIA requests across government. So we don't know what the government-wide FOIA backlog looks like without those reports.
What are the agency FOIA offices saying they're going to do to address the staffing gaps?
Yeah, in some cases, they are actually looking now at their staffing plans to see if they need to right size and hire again. The Defense Department specifically mentioned that it is reevaluating its staffing to determine if they have the enough staff to process requests. And they're also looking at a lot of other ways, though, to improve processing times. And one of those is technology, of course. And I mentioned how AI is helping requesters make requests. It also has the potential to help offices process these requests. And for several years now, agencies have really been exploring AI, automation, and machine learning related technologies to see how they could automate different steps in the FOIA process, from intaking a request and determining whether it might actually already have information that's publicly available that meets the request, to actually redacting documents and processing documents themselves. And so you're seeing basically every FOIA office report that they are looking into those tools. They are starting to develop and adopt them, but it's the early stages of adopting at this point.
And how do federal FOIA leaders see that AI deployment playing out across government?
Yeah, this has been a big emphasis for the Justice Department Office of Information Policy, which oversees FOIA across government. They actually have annual FOIA awards, and one of the categories is for exceptional advancements in IT. So OIP for a long time has recognized that FOIA offices need to adopt technology to process more modern technologies to process these requests that just keep increasing year over year. Sean Glendening is director of OIP these days. He spoke during a March 18th webinar hosted by the Americans for Prosperity Foundation about how artificial intelligence particularly has a big role in the future of FOIA.
there's a various spectrum of how much AI. You have things like the FOIA wizard. You have some agencies that have leaned more heavily into it. I think all of them, or almost all of them, right now, if they haven't incorporated it yet, are leaning into and examining software and programs that will incorporate it. And so I think in the next few years, you are going to see every agency actively using AI in some aspects. Some will use it more, some will use it less, but I think it will be across the board.
As we wrap this up, I mean, FOIA is a foundational concept in terms of government transparency. Is there any concern about that transparency as AI enables both more FOIA requests and perhaps more FOIA responses?
Oh, certainly. I think there's a huge concern about transparency across the board. You know, FOIA offices, because of these rising backlogs, a lot of them are not able to respond to requests for years. And in a lot of cases, to get a FOIA request fast-tracked, you essentially need to sue the government now to get those documents out within a relevant time frame. And so I think there's a lot of concern about how broken the FOIA process is now. And I don't think everyone is looking at AI as a magic kind of bullet here. Glendinning also mentioned during that webinar that technology in general just needs to improve across federal FOIA offices and across government in general in terms of how they process records. It's still very outdated. And so that's going to be kind of those small technology improvements across agencies is really key to helping FOIA offices meet this rising demand for requests.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. It will be interesting to see how this plays out, Justin.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.